Brad Pitt, an Oscar winner, for more than 3 decades, standing at the pinnacle of fame, a living icon who has redefined the image of a man in modern Hollywood, from the cool, rebellious gaze in Fight Club to the dark and haunting depth in C-17. He has conquered the brightest screen on the planet, with his weighted silence, iron discipline, and an effortless charisma that no one can replace. Millions admire him as a symbol of freedom, of strength, of a man who seems unbreakable by anything. To the world, he is the embodiment of everything perfect: fame, money, immortal roles, relationships that captivate the media, and a life that everyone believes has reached the ultimate dream. But behind all that glory is a story that is not perfect at all, not radiant at all, but quietly and heavier than anyone ever imagined. A childhood not destroyed by obvious tragedy, but missing one thing more important: the truth about himself. The years growing up when he learned to become what others expected before understanding who he really was. A city that saw him, honored him, but only loved the image of him, never touching the real person. Relationships that seemed destined, but ultimately left gaps that could not be filled. A family that was once the only place he felt he belonged, then broke apart in a way that no one could go back and fix. And then the years after that, when the lights gradually dimmed, when the applause became distant, when the silence began to speak the things he had avoided his whole life. And now, at the age of 63, when time is no longer wide open, when the past can no longer be rewritten, what is really happening with Brad Pitt in the shadow of fame and the memories that have never been willing to rest? If this story makes you see Brad Pitt in a completely different way, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts, where the truth is gradually revealed. It did not begin with an obvious tragedy, but with a prolonged silence. Brad Pitt was born and raised in Missouri, in a family that anyone looking from the outside would call stable. His father, a strict and principled man, worked in the transportation industry. His mother, gentler, was the one who always tried to keep the family running orderly and peaceful. Their home lacked nothing. There was no violence. There were no intense arguments. There were no breakdowns that people had to retell as a tragic story. There were evenings spent together. There were full meals. There were Sundays where faith came first. A childhood that, if viewed through the lens of the world, seemed like nothing was wrong. But sometimes, precisely the places where nothing is wrong are where the most important things quietly disappear. In that house, everything was right, except for one thing. No one really asked how he was feeling. Love was there, but it was a form of conditional love. It was expressed through discipline, through responsibility, through becoming a good child. Not through understanding, not through listening to a child who was learning to understand himself. Brad Pitt grew up in an environment where emotions were not forbidden, but also not encouraged to exist. He learned to stay silent. He learned to do the right thing. He learned to become what others expected. And little by little, he began to trade the truth inside himself for acceptance from the outside. There was no specific moment when everything collapsed. There was no single painful memory to point to and say, that was where everything started to go wrong. It came slowly, quietly, like a small crack in the wall. No one noticed until it spread everywhere. At school, he was a good student. At home, he was a good student. At daytime, he was a model that others could trust. But deep inside, he did not know who he was outside of all those roles. And the most dangerous thing was, no one realized that, not even himself, because when a child is taught that everything is fine, he will never learn to question whether that is true or not. There was an invisible pressure existing in that space of pressure that needed no words but was always present. Be better, be good, be right. Do not make mistakes. Do not stray from the path already set. Do not do anything that disappoints others. And so, Day by day, Brad Pitt not only learned to live, but learned to perform a version of himself, good enough to be loved. Perform a person who caused no trouble, asks no questions, revealed too much, and then, at some point, the boundary between the real person and the person he presented began to blur. The most painful thing was not that he was not loved, but that he was loved, but not for his real self. He was loved for what he showed, for what he did right, for the image he maintained. And when love became a reward for perfection, then the truth inside would gradually be buried. That was where the emptiness began to form. An emptiness that was not loud, not intense, but always there. A feeling that something was missing, even though everything around was right. A distance from himself that he could not name, and over time that emptiness did not disappear. It grew with him. It grew in every decision, every relationship, every step of his life. And when the world began to see Brad Pitt, to honor him, to desire to be him, then no one knew that it all had started from a very peaceful place. A place with no obvious tragedy, but lacking the truth. A childhood that did not make him collapse, but also did not teach him how to stand firm as his true self. And sometimes that is the deepest tragedy, when a person grows up not by losing everything, but by never really having himself from the beginning. And then, from that emptiness, something else began to form. Not loud, not sudden, but persistent and more dangerous than any incident. Brad Pitt not only learned to live in the world around him, he learned to adjust himself to fit it. From very early on, he recognized a simple rule. When you do the right thing, you are recognized. When you do not bother anyone, you are loved. And so, day by day, he became the version everyone expected. A good child, a good student, a person who caused no trouble, not because he knew that was his true self, but because that was the only way to feel he had value. But there was a price to pay for that rightness. The more he tried to please others, the further he drifted from himself, the more he became what others wanted to see, the less he knew who he really was when no one was looking. Simple questions, what do I want? Who am I? Never had a chance to be answered, not because he was not smart, but because he had never been taught how to listen to himself. Instead, he learned to observe others. He learned to guess what would please them. He learned to adjust his voice, behavior, choices, to always fit the situation. And then, a second person began to appear. Not fake in the sense of lying, but a carefully built version to survive, a persona, a shell polished over time, smooth enough that no one suspected, convincing enough that he himself sometimes believed it was his true self. The scary thing was, it worked. He was loved, he was accepted, he was praised. Everything seemed to be going in the right direction. But deep inside, there was a silence that no praise could fill, a vague feeling that everything he received was not really for his true self, that if that shell disappeared, perhaps there would be nothing left. And so, he clung to it even tighter, kept it perfect, kept it from cracking, because if it broke, he would have to face something he had never learned to face, himself, at school, with friends, in the family. He continued to play the role perfectly. No one saw the struggle. No one saw the uncertainty. No one saw a boy trying to understand himself in a world that never asked. And the most painful thing was, he himself did not realize it was happening, because when you perform long enough, the role begins to feel real. And when that happens, you no longer know where you end, and what you created to survive begins. The feeling of emptiness did not come like a storm. It came like an absence, a prolonged silence between moments that should have had emotion. Joy was not complete. Success did not really touch. Everything was fine, but never enough. And he could not explain why, because from the outside looking in, there was no reason to feel that way. But that very thing made it even lonelier. Because when your pain has no clear shape, no one knows how to see it, and you do not know how to say it. So he continued to live, continued to do well, continued to do well, continued to become what the world expected. But in a very deep place inside, a seed had been planted, the seed of a tragedy that was not loud but persistent, a life built on roles instead of truth. And when that life began to grow more complex with more pressure, that seed grew along with it. Because you can play a role in a small room, but you cannot keep it forever when the whole world starts looking. And then, one day, when the brightest lights shine directly on you, the question you have avoided your whole life will come back clearer than ever. If everything they see is just a role, then where is your real self? And does it even still exist? And then, at a point where everything seemed already arranged, a clear path, a right future, a life that anyone could predict, Brad Pitt did something that even he himself did not fully understand at the time. He stepped out of it. The decision to leave college was not an impulsive act, but the first crack in the shell he had built for many years. There was no dramatic moment. There was no big rebellion. It was just a feeling that became clearer and clearer that if he continued on this path, he would disappear completely inside his own life. And so he left, not because he knew where he was going, but because he knew he could not stay. Los Angeles appeared like a promise, a place where people came to start over, a city of opportunities, of dreams, of people searching for a different version of themselves. When he set foot there, for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never truly had before: freedom. No more familiar gazes, no more invisible expectations, no more roles he had to maintain every day. There he could become anyone, and in that moment he believed he was finding himself. The first days passed like a fresh wind. The air was different, the rhythm of life was different. A feeling of relief when no one knew who he was. No one expected anything from him. He tried new things, met new people, began to step into the world of acting not as a clear plan, but as a curiosity, a door that happened to open. And in all of that, there was a quiet belief that grew stronger. Perhaps this was where he would become his true self. But the truth did not change that quickly, because you could leave a place, but you could not leave yourself. What he carried was not just a suitcase, a few clothes, and vague dreams. He carried all the years he had learned to please others. He carried a person who was used to playing a role. He carried an emptiness that had never been filled. And gradually, even in that freedom, the old patterns began to return. He still observed others. He still adjusted himself to fit. He still searched for acceptance, even though no one directly asked for it anymore. The only difference was that now he no longer realized he was doing it. Acting, in a strange way, was both an escape and a trap. On stage, in front of the camera, he could become anyone, a different person, a different life, a different emotion. And that gave him a sense of aliveness he had never had before. But at the same time, it also reinforced something he had learned long ago, that his value came from becoming someone else, not from being himself. The laughter, the compliments, the recognizing eyes, all of them were for the roles, not for the person behind them. And over time, that boundary became even more blurred. He was not only searching for himself, he was continuing to avoid it. The initial feeling of freedom gradually turned into something hard to name. It was no longer complete liberation, but a wider space to continue getting lost. Because when there were no limits, no direction, no inner anchor, freedom could also become another form of loneliness, a form of drifting where you did not know where you were going, only that you were going. And in all of that, there was a truth he was not ready to face, that the problem had never been where he lived, but in the way he existed. You could change cities, change jobs, change the people around you. But if you had never learned to understand yourself, then every place you went would become a different version of the same story. And that story still had no solution. But at that time, he did not know that. For him, Los Angeles was still hope. It was a beginning. It was the place where he believed he was getting closer to the truth, without realizing that, right there, the journey of losing himself continued only in a more subtle form, harder to recognize, and much more dangerous. And then, when the novelty of Los Angeles gradually faded, reality began to appear. Not loud, not dramatic, but cold and prolonged. Brad Pitt did not step straight into the spotlight. There were no big roles waiting for him. No doors opened automatically just because he believed he deserved it. Instead, there were long repeating days, temporary jobs just enough to survive, driving delivery, cleaning, even putting on a mascot costume to promote on the streets under the harsh California sun. Jobs no one remembered the name of, just as no one remembered him. Mornings started early, ended late. The money earned was only enough to pay rent and a few simple meals. Life had nothing remarkable, except a feeling that became clearer and clearer that he was standing on the edge of a world he had come to conquer. Every day, he went to casting calls, small rooms, waiting chairs, unfamiliar faces all the same. Everyone hoped, everyone tried, and most would not be chosen. He read lines, tried to perform, tried to prove he deserved a chance. But then, the answer was always the same. We will call you back. And they never called. Day after day, week after week, that silence began to weigh heavier than any rejection, because at least when rejected, you knew you had been seen. But when no one called back, you began to wonder if you had ever existed in their eyes at all. This city was not cruel in an obvious way. It did not push you down. It did not tell you that you were not good enough. It simply did not see you. And in a place where everything revolved around being seen, being noticed, being recognized, being overlooked, hurt more than any failure. At night, when he returned to the small room, maybe a temporary rental corner, a creaky bed, walls that carried no traces of a life, the silence became clearer. There was no one to talk to. No one asked how his day was. No one remembered that he had been there. He existed physically, eating, working, moving, breathing, but emotionally, he gradually disappeared. The feeling of loneliness did not come like a big wave. It crept into every small moment. When sitting alone in a cheap diner, when watching others walk by, busy with their own lives, when standing in the middle of a crowded street, but no eyes stopped on him. And in all of that, a thought began to form quietly, but dangerously. Perhaps he did not really belong here. Perhaps he was not enough. But even in that doubt, he still continued, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he had nowhere else to return to, and perhaps, deep inside, there was still a small part that refused to give up a part that believed if he persisted long enough, if he kept moving, something would change. But each day that passed, that part became a little weaker. Faith did not disappear immediately. It wore down gradually, like a voice getting smaller and smaller in a room that was too big. And during that time, a truth began to emerge, not about the world, but about himself. That all the years before, all the roles he had learned to perform did not help him stand firm here, because in a city that only cared about the surface, he did not know what he was beneath that shell. And so, in a place full of light, he lived like a shadow, walking through streets without leaving a trace, meeting people without creating memories, existing, but not really living. And perhaps that was the most painful part of this journey. Not that he failed, but that he gradually got used to the feeling of not being seen, not being remembered, and no longer sure that he had anything to be seen in the first place. And then, after all those days of being forgotten, something finally happened, fast to the point where it was almost impossible to realize. A door opened. Not big, not loud. It was just a small opportunity in a movie that at the time no one thought would change his life. Brad Pitt stepped into the role in Thelma and Louise, a charming drifter, a young guy who appeared in one moment, then disappeared. The role was not long. The screen time was not much. But when the movie was released, there was one thing no one could deny. The world stopped and saw him. No longer a name in the casting list. No longer a face passing through the waiting room. In one night, he became what all of Hollywood craved, a phenomenon. Eyes poured onto him, endless compliments. Headlines began to call his name like a new discovery, a new icon, a face the public could not take their eyes off. And for the first time in his life, he was seen. But there was a truth that very few people realized at that time. What they saw was not his real self. They saw an image, a body, a gaze, a charm perfectly framed in a few minutes on screen. And then that image began to live its own life. The media called him a sex symbol. Audiences associated him with attractiveness, with rebellion, with a type of masculinity they craved but could not touch. And in all of that, the real person of Brad Pitt was once again pushed to the back. The irony was this was exactly what he had once wished for: to be seen, to be recognized, to step out of the shadow of invisibility. But when it really happened, it did not bring the feeling he had imagined, because that recognition did not touch the deepest part of him. It only touched the shell he had learned to build long ago. And so, instead of finding himself, he became locked even tighter in another version, a more perfect version, brighter but also more alien. Opportunities began to come more often. Bigger roles, more attractive contracts. The life he had only been able to imagine before now became reality. But with it came a new pressure, a more subtle pressure, harder to escape: keep being what they had seen. Do not change. Do not break that image. Do not show them anything else. And so he continued to perform, not only on screen, but in his own life. He kept that gaze, kept that demeanor, kept the charm the world had fallen in love with. Because if he let it go, who would still stay? Who would still look at him? Who would still remember him? And in that process, something began to happen, quietly, but irreversibly. The gap between the real person and the person the world saw grew larger and larger. He was surrounded by attention, but it never felt lonelier, because all those eyes did not see him. They saw an image, a role, a dream they wanted to believe was real, and he, over time, also began to believe in it. Not because he wanted to, but because that was the only way to survive in this world. The more famous he became, the more he had to keep that shell intact. The more loved he was, the fewer chances he had to break it. And so, a paradox began to form, a paradox no one spoke about, but was always present. The more he was seen, the more he disappeared. Not disappearing from the world, but disappearing from himself. The man who once stood in the shadows, craving recognition, now stood under the brightest lights, but no longer sure that the person they were applauding was him or not. And perhaps that was the real turning point. Not the moment the world recognized Brad Pitt, but the moment he began to lose the ability to recognize himself. And then, when the gaze of the world was no longer a fleeting moment, but became a continuous flow, Brad Pitt stepped into a phase where everything seemed to reach its peak and also began to slip out of control. He was no longer just a promising actor. He became the sex symbol of an entire generation. Major magazines printed his picture on the cover. Lists of the most attractive men in the world kept calling his name. The public's gaze did not stop at admiration, but turned into a form of desire that was almost obsessive. And at the center of all that, he stood there, seen more than ever before, but also defined more than ever before. At first, it felt like a reward, after all those years of being overlooked, forgotten, treated as if he did not exist. Becoming the center of attention brought a feeling he had never experienced. It was like a confirmation that he had value, that he was enough, that he deserved to be here. But that feeling did not stay in a healthy way. It did not become a solid foundation. It became something he began to need quietly, but more and more clearly. He began to get addicted to the feeling of being seen. Not just seen, but desired, recognized, mentioned, expected. Every gaze, every compliment, every headline became a small dose that reinforced a fragile belief inside that he still existed. And when that feeling became the only source of validation, it also became something he could not do without. His life, at some point, began to revolve around the gaze of others. His choices, his decisions, the way he appeared, all were shaped by a question that was never spoken. How will they see me? He no longer just lived, he performed, not because he wanted to deceive, but because he was no longer sure who he was without that gaze. The roles kept coming, each one different, each character with its own color. But underneath it all, there was one thing that did not change. He was still searching for himself through how others reacted to him. And that, over time, began to create a distortion he did not immediately recognize. Because when you live too long in the reflection of others, you gradually forget what your real image looks like. The people around him did not help much either. They saw a star, an icon, an asset, not a man struggling with questions of identity. And so, no one really asked him what he needed to be asked most. Are you okay? Because from the outside, he was not just okay. He was living the life that millions dreamed of. But that very thing made everything more dangerous. Because when you have it all, you no longer have a clear reason to feel loss. And when you have no reason, you also have no way to explain your emptiness. So he kept going, kept becoming what the world wanted, kept holding the image they had loved. But little by little, he began to lose control over his own identity. It was no longer clear which decisions were his and which were reactions to expectations. It was no longer clear where the real person was and where the shell that had been built too perfectly was. And the scariest thing was, he no longer felt the difference, because when a role lasts long enough, it no longer feels like a role. It becomes the only reality you know. And in that reality, Brad Pitt no longer lived for himself. He lived for the image, for the gaze, for the recognition, for what others needed him to become. And every time he stepped out in front of the public, every time he appeared on screen, every time he was applauded, he moved a little further away from the real person he had never truly understood. The more he was loved, the more alien he became to himself. The more he was desired, the harder it was to touch the truth inside. And then, in a very deep, very quiet place, a question began to form, not clear, not constant, but never disappearing. If everything they love is just this image, then would anyone still love his real self if it were revealed? And he had no answer. Because by that time, even he was no longer sure what that real person looked like anymore. And then, when the shell became too thick to pierce with words, Brad Pitt began to speak in a different way. Not in interviews, not in front of media cameras, but on screen. The roles he chose were no longer purely career opportunities. They became fragments of something deeper, a inner chaos he had never been able to name. And the clearest of all was Fight Club. Tyler Durden was not just a character. He was rebellion. He was destruction. He was the scream of a man trapped in patterns he no longer believed in. He lived outside the rules. He said things no one dared to say. He smashed everything to feel he still existed. And when Brad Pitt embodied that character, something was no longer pure acting. It felt like a release, a way to say things he had never been able to say in real life, a way to feel emotions he had suppressed for too long. Audiences saw Tyler Durden and were drawn to the freedom, the danger, the rebellion. But perhaps they did not realize that behind that gaze, behind that smile, was a part of Brad Pitt being exposed. Not all of it, but enough to make the boundary between the role and the real person begin to shake. And that was not the only time. The roles that followed, even if different on the surface all, carried a similar shade. People searching for meaning, struggling with identity, trying to break something inside. He did not just choose roles, he was drawn to them, as if each character touched a part he had never dared to face directly. And so acting became the only place where he could be honest, not by saying, "I am in pain," but by becoming someone who was in pain. Not by admitting the chaos, but by living in it, at least for the duration of a movie. But that also came with a price. Because when you use art to release what you cannot handle in real life, you do not really solve it. You only temporarily escape it. And when the scene ends, when the director calls cut, when the lights go out, it is all still there, waiting, silent, unchanged. The boundary between the role and the real person began to blur in a way he did not immediately recognize. He brought the character home, brought the emotions, brought the thoughts that were only supposed to exist in the script. And over time, it was no longer clear which emotions belonged to the character and which belonged to him. What was once an escape began to become a gray area, a place where truth and fiction blended together, making it even harder for him to find an anchor. But at the same time, it was also the only place where he felt he was telling the truth. Because in everyday life he was still surrounded by expectations, by the image, by the invisible roles he had to maintain. But on screen he was allowed to break, allowed to be wrong, allowed to be chaotic. And that, in a painful way, became the only form of honesty he knew. Cinema was not just Brad Pitt's profession. It became the place where he confessed without having to confess. The place where he could say everything without saying anything directly. But a confession that is not understood is not a release. It is only an echo. And over time, that echo began to weaken, not because he had nothing left to say, but because he was moving further and further away from the person saying those things. Because to truly understand a confession, you have to know who is confessing. And that was exactly what he still had not found. So he continued to act, continued to choose roles that touched something deep inside, continued to use the screen as a distorted mirror to look back at himself. But every time he looked, the image became a little more blurred. And in all those roles, in all those lines, those gazes, those explosive moments, there was a quiet truth that existed. He was saying so much, but had never truly been heard. And perhaps that was the deepest tragedy, when a person finds a way to express everything he feels but still cannot reach himself in the process. And then, amid all the roles, the lights and the questions that never had answers, Brad Pitt stepped into a new chapter of his life, one that, at least from the outside, seemed to bring answers to everything that was still missing. He met Jennifer Aniston, and almost immediately their story became what all of Hollywood wanted to believe in. They were beautiful, they were famous, they were successful. Two people standing at the peak of their careers, finding each other in a world that was always moving. The photos, the appearances together, the smiles on the red carpet, all created an image that the public not only admired, but also craved a perfect love, a marriage that seemed to have no cracks. Their wedding was called a Hollywood fairy tale, and in one moment, Brad Pitt was not just a star, he became part of a story that the whole world wanted to believe was true. But just like so many things in his life, the surface was not the whole truth. Inside that relationship, there was a distance that no lens could capture. It was not a lack of affection, it was not a lack of care, but something more subtle, harder to name, a lack of connection at the deepest level of being. They loved each other, but in the ways they understood, and sometimes that was not enough. Brad Pitt, who had spent his whole life becoming what others expected, continued to play a new role, the role of a perfect husband. He showed up at the right time, said the right things, did the right things, and from the outside, looking in, there was no reason to doubt that he was living a fulfilled life. But deep inside, that familiar feeling began to return. The emptiness he had once felt in the silence of childhood, in the years searching for himself, in the gaze of the world, now appeared even in a relationship that was supposed to bring meaning, not because Jennifer Aniston was not enough, not because that marriage lacked what others called happiness, but because Brad Pitt still had not found himself. And when you do not know who you are, you cannot truly connect with someone else, no matter how close they are to you. The private moments, without an audience, became heavier, not because of big conflicts, but because there were things left unsaid, emotions not understood, prolonged silences that no one knew how to fill. And in those silences, he began to realize a truth he had never faced directly, that even when you have everything the world considers perfect, you can still feel missing something that no one can see. The media continued to build the story. They continued to call it ideal love. They continued to believe this was proof that Brad Pitt had found balance, stability, completeness. But that very thing made him feel more trapped. Because when the whole world believes you are happy, you no longer have space to admit that you are not. And so he continued to hold that image, continued to smile, continued to play the role. But each day that passed, the gap between what others saw and what he felt grew larger, and perhaps the most painful thing was not that the marriage was not perfect, but that it could not become the place where he found the truth, because a relationship, no matter how beautiful, cannot fill the emptiness that a person has never learned to face within himself. And in all of that, something else gradually emerged, not immediately clear, but unavoidable. A beautiful life does not mean a real life. You can have everything the world considers success. You can live in a story that everyone admires. But if you have never truly understood who you are, then all of that, no matter how radiant, is just a layer of light covering an emptiness that no one sees except you. And then, when the emptiness in a perfect life became too clear to ignore, something else appeared. Powerful, unexpected, and uncontrollable. Brad Pitt met Angelina Jolie, and from that moment, everything began to change in a way that even he could not foresee. If the previous relationship was like a beautiful painting, balanced and carefully drawn, then this was like a storm. Not perfect, not controlled, but alive to the point where it could not be denied. Angelina was not just another woman. She was another world, strong, complex, full of wounds, full of stories, and most importantly, she did not need Brad Pitt to become anyone other than himself. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, he felt something he had only touched before through his roles. Truth. Not perfection, not the image, but real emotions, vivid, sometimes chaotic, sometimes hard to understand, but not fake. Their love did not come from stability. It came from collision, from differences, from seeing each other in places that others had never touched. And in that, Brad Pitt felt seen not as a symbol, not as an image, but as a human being. The family they built together did not resemble any pattern that Hollywood had ever known. 6 children, each carrying their own story, a different starting point, a different world. Their home was not just a living space, but an ecosystem of emotions, of responsibility, of meaning. No longer quiet dinners, perfectly arranged moments, but laughter, tears, chaos, difficult decisions, trips, choices with a humanity that went beyond Hollywood lights. And in all of that, Brad Pitt felt he was living, really living, not performing, not showing, but present. Perhaps for the first time, he did not need to become someone else to be loved. But that very thing also came with a price, because truth, when it arrives too fast, too strong, can reveal everything you are not ready to face. Their love was deep, but also intense. It did not hide the cracks, it magnified them. It did not soothe the emptiness, it forced you to look straight at them. And over time, that intensity began to become pressure. Not pressure from the outside, but from the relationship itself. Two people, both complex, both carrying unhealed parts, began to collide in ways that love could not always resolve. The differences that once drew them to each other now became sources of tension. The emotions that once made everything alive now became too big to control. And Brad Pitt, who had found in this relationship a feeling of real that he had never had, began to feel something familiar returning: disorientation. Not because love disappeared, but because it became too heavy, too deep, too real. And when you have never truly understood yourself, living in a love like that can become a challenge you do not know how to overcome. The cracks did not appear immediately. They started small. Differences in perspective, silences that lasted longer than usual, misunderstandings not fully resolved. But like everything that had happened before in his life, they did not disappear. They accumulated. And when they accumulated long enough, they were no longer small cracks. They became gaps that no one knew how to fill. The most painful thing was, this was the relationship where he felt the most real. This was where he felt closest to himself. And precisely because of that, when it began to crack, it was not just an emotional crisis. It was a breakdown on a deeper level. A breakdown of the belief that he had finally found where he belonged. And in all of that, a truth gradually emerged, not easy to accept, but undeniable. The deeper the love, the greater the hurt. Because when you put your entire self into a relationship, you not only risk losing that person, you risk losing the version of yourself you had found in that love. And if you have never truly understood who you are before stepping into it, then, when it begins to fall apart, you will not only hurt, you will be lost. And then, amid everything they had built together, a large family, a life full of meaning, an image the world called extraordinary, the cracks began to appear. Not loud, not sudden, but deep enough to change everything over time. Brad Pitt stood in the middle of a life that, from the outside, looked like the peak of every dream. 6 children, a strong partner, a career that continued to grow, and a position that very few could reach. They were not just a family, they were a symbol, an image that went beyond Hollywood, humanitarian, profound, meaningful. But precisely when everything looked most perfect was when the pressure became the most invisible and the heaviest. Fame did not stop when he came home. It followed him into every room, every meal, every private moment. The gazes, the expectations, the stories others told about his life, none of them disappeared just because he wanted to be a father, a husband. And between all those roles, he began to feel pulled between the person the world saw and the person his family needed. Being a father to 6 children from different circumstances, responsibility was not just love, but presence, stability, understanding. But to do that, you needed something Brad Pitt still did not really have: a solid anchor within himself. And when that anchor did not exist, everything else began to become more fragile. The first signs were not clear. There was no specific event to mark that this is where everything started to crack. It came as a feeling. Conversations no longer felt complete, gazes no longer connected as before. Moments that once were full of meaning now became heavier. And in all of that, there was a truth no one spoke, but both felt. Something was changing. Conflicts did not always come from big things. Sometimes they came from small differences that were not resolved. Different views on life, on responsibility, on the meaning of what they were doing. Angelina continued to look outward to humanitarian missions, global journeys, a life always moving and full of purpose. Brad Pitt, somewhere deep inside, began to search for something else, a quietness, a stopping point, a way to understand himself that he had never had the chance for. And those two directions, at first only slightly off, gradually created distance. Not because they no longer cared, but because they were no longer moving at the same pace. And when the pace differs, even the closest people can begin to drift apart. Pressure from the outside only made everything more complicated. Every step they took was observed. Every change was analyzed. There was no space to make mistakes, no space to be weak. And in such an environment, problems did not disappear. They were just hidden better. But truth always finds a way to surface, not through big moments, but through accumulation. Brad Pitt began to feel a contradiction he could not clearly explain. He had everything he once thought would bring meaning, but still felt something was not right. Not with the world, but with himself. And when you do not understand what is happening inside, you also cannot explain it to others. So he stayed silent, continued, tried to keep everything stable. But each day that passed, the gap between what he showed and what he felt grew larger. And that began to affect everything around, though no one could point out exactly how. The family was still there, life continued, the image remained intact. But underneath, something was gradually collapsing, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a structure cracking from the inside, still standing on the surface, but no longer whole at the core. And perhaps the scariest thing was not the collapse that was coming, but that no one really saw it approaching. Not because they did not care, but because everything still looked fine, and that very thing made it inevitable. Because what is not seen is also what is not healed. And when a life built on too many shells begins to crack, the question is no longer whether it will collapse, but when. And then the inevitable finally happened. Not like a series of small cracks, but like a break that could not be reversed. One night in 2016, on a private flight, where it should have been the private space of the family, everything collapsed. No one outside really knew everything that happened in that moment, but it was enough for the world to know that something had gone beyond the limit. Brad Pitt, the man who had spent his whole life controlling his image, maintaining the fragile balance between his real self and the person the world saw, in that moment could no longer control himself, and in just one night everything changed. There was no time to process, no space to heal, only consequences quick, clear, and irreversible. Shortly after, Angelina Jolie filed for divorce, not after years of negotiation, not after a long process, but almost immediately, as if it was a decision that had accumulated for a very long time, only waiting for a moment to become action. And when that happened, Brad Pitt did not just lose a relationship, he lost the structure that had kept him standing for many years. The family, the only place he had ever felt he truly belonged, suddenly was no longer the same. The children, who had once been the center of his life, who had once made everything meaningful, now became a distance he did not know how to cross. Not because he did not love them, but because things had happened that love was not enough to fix right away. Losing connection is not an event, it is a process. And that process began from that very moment when trust was shaken, when the image of a father changed in the eyes of the children, when meetings were no longer natural as before. And for a man who had once found his truth in the role of a father, that was not just a loss. It was the collapse of the very thing he had believed was the most real. But everything did not stop there. Because this was not just a personal crisis. This was Brad Pitt, and the world was watching. The media did not wait. Headlines appeared quickly, relentlessly, without mercy. Speculations, rumors, details exaggerated, distorted, dissected under the light of collective curiosity. In a very short time, the image he had built for decades began to crack in public. No longer the perfect symbol, no longer the unbreakable man, but a human being with mistakes, limitations, moments that could not be justified, and in all of that, there was a feeling no article could describe accurately, the emptiness after losing what was most important. Not fame, not career, but family. The only place he had ever felt he did not need to perform. The only place he had ever believed he could be himself. And now, it was no longer the same. Perhaps everything still existed on paper. There were still meetings. There were still connections. But the feeling of belonging, the thing he had spent his whole life searching for, disappeared once again. And this time, it was not quiet like before. It was clear, painful, undeniable. It was not just a divorce. It was a brutal awakening, a moment when everything he had built, not only on the outside but also inside, was called into question. He could no longer hide in his roles. He could no longer rely on the image. He could no longer hide behind the gaze of others. Because when you lose what is most important, everything else becomes much smaller. And in the silence after that storm, when the media began searching for the next story, when the world continued to turn, Brad Pitt stood still. No more lights, no more roles, no more applause, only a man, and a truth he could no longer avoid. He had lost his family. He had lost the only place that had ever felt real. And for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing left to hide it. And then, when all the noise from the outside gradually died down the headlines, the judgments, the non-stop gazes, only one emptiness remained that Brad Pitt could no longer avoid. Himself, no more family to return to in the old way. No more familiar structure to hold on to. No more perfect story to maintain. Only a man standing in the silence, and the things he had tried to avoid his whole life began to appear clearer than ever. The first days after the incident were not loud, but heavy. There was no dramatic collapse. There was no moment when he completely fell apart in front of the world. Instead, it was a slow fall, a disintegration happening inside. No one saw it, no one heard it, but it could not be denied. Alcohol did not appear as a conscious choice. It appeared as a way to soothe the emptiness, a way to blur the thoughts he did not want to face, a way to extend a little more distance between him and the truth. Evenings began earlier. Glasses of alcohol became more frequent, and gradually, it was no longer just a habit. It became a refuge, a place where he could temporarily not think about what had been lost, what had happened, and what he could not change. But the truth does not disappear just because you try to forget it. It waits patiently. And when the intoxication fades, it returns, clearer, sharper. The feeling of guilt did not come like a big wave. It crept into every small moment, when he remembered conversations that had never happened, when he thought about the eyes he had hurt, when he realized that there were things, even if he tried as hard as he could, that could not go back to the way they were. Failure in this case was not losing fame or career, but the feeling that he had not become the person he once hoped he could be, especially in the most important roles of his life. And the most painful thing was, this time, he could not blame anyone, not his childhood, not the pressure of Hollywood, not the media or circumstances, because when everything was stripped away, when there were no more shells to hide behind, the truth became cruelly simple. He had to face himself, The long nights became the place where all of that gathered. No cameras, no audience, no roles to escape into, only silence and thoughts that could not stop. He lay there, more awake than ever, and for the first time in many years, he truly listened to himself. Not the version the world saw, not the version he had learned to perform, but the remaining part fragile, uncertain, full of unanswered questions. And in those moments, a realization began to form, slowly, painfully, but unavoidably. The greatest enemy of his had never been the world. Not the people who did not see him, not the people who misunderstood him, not the pressure, fame, or anything outside, but himself. It was the choices he had made. It was the things he had avoided. It was the parts of himself he had never truly faced. And that was not a release. It did not bring immediate relief. It brought another kind of burden, a deeper kind of burden, because you cannot run away from it. You can leave a place. You can leave a person. But you cannot leave yourself. And when you realize that, everything changes. Not in an easy way, not in a quick way, but in a way that forces you to stay. Stay with the thoughts. Stay with the emotions. Stay with the truth you have avoided for too long. Brad Pitt did not find answers immediately in that period. There was no clear awakening moment. There was no turning point where everything suddenly became right. There was only a process, slow, uncertain, sometimes so painful that he wanted to go back to the blur of alcohol, to the comfort of not having to think. But this time, there was something different. There was a part of him, though very small, that began to accept that this was the only path left. Not to fix everything, not to return to the past, but to understand, at least once, who his real self was when there was nothing left to hide. And in that silence, in those endless long nights, something began to change. Not the world around him, but the way he looked at himself. And perhaps that was the first step, not of healing, but of truth. And then, after the endless nights with no escape, when the silence was no longer a place to hide but a place to face, Brad Pitt began to do something he had never truly done before. Seek help, not from the lights, not from roles, not from wolves world could give him, but from people who were also standing in front of the cracks of their own. He stepped into Alcoholics Anonymous, a room with no fame, no privileges, no image. There, no one cared who he was out there. No one needed him to be perfect. No one required him to become anything other than a person trying to stand firm. And for the first time in many years, he did not need to perform. The meetings did not bring immediate release. There were no miracles. There were no moments when everything suddenly became easy. But there was one thing he had never had before: honesty. The stories, shared unpolished, unedited, made him realize that his pain was not the only thing that existed. And in listening to others, he began to learn how to listen to himself. Not to fix, but to understand. Along with that, he turned to something else, a thing that did not require words, did not require explanation: art. Sculpture. Painting. Raw materials, unfinished shapes, lines that did not need to be correct. There, he did not need to explain how he felt. He just needed to do. And in that process, some things began to surface, not in the form of words, but in the form of images, textures, things that only he truly understood. Art did not heal him in the way people usually think. It did not erase what had happened. It did not make the past lighter, but it gave him a place to put what he carried, a place where pain could exist without needing to be solved right away. And perhaps that was exactly what he needed, because gradually another realization began to form, not strong, not clear from the beginning, but undeniable. There are things that cannot be fixed. There are conversations that will never happen. There are moments that have passed with no way to go back. There are relationships that, even if they still exist, will never be the same as before. And for the first time, instead of fighting against that, he began to accept it. Not by surrender, but by the understanding that not everything in life can be solved. Some things can only be carried. His life began to slow down, not because he no longer had the ability to run fast, but because he no longer wanted to. Mornings no longer started with pressure. Days were no longer filled with roles he had to perform. He walked. He sat still. He spent time on small things he had never truly noticed before, not because they were more important than what he once had, but because, for the first time, he was present long enough to feel them, and in that slowing down, a different kind of truth began to appear. Not radiant, not perfect, but real. He no longer tried to become the image the world wanted. He no longer tried to prove anything. He no longer tried to fix everything that had broken, but just lived, day by day, with everything that remained. But this was not a healing story in the way people usually tell. There was no neat ending. There was no completely better version emerging from the ruins. Because the truth is, he was not healed. What had happened was still there. The emotions still existed. The emptiness did not disappear just because he had learned to look at it. But there was a difference, a small but decisive difference. He no longer ran away from it. He learned to live with it. He learned to wake up every day with what he carried and still continue. Not because everything was fine, but because he no longer needed it to be fine in order to live. And perhaps that was the biggest change. Not that he became more perfect, but that he accepted he would never be perfect. Not that he fixed the past, but that he was no longer completely defined by it. Not that the pain disappeared, but that he no longer let it decide every step he took. And in all of that, there was a quiet but profound truth sometimes. Strength does not lie in overcoming pain, but in learning how to live with it, without losing the rest of yourself. And then, after the years of running away, after the times of trying to become what others expected, after the losses that could not be named, Brad Pitt stood still, no longer as before, no longer in a hurry, no longer trying to fill the emptiness with lights, with roles, with recognition. At the age of 63, he was not the perfect version the world once believed in. He was also not the man who had completely collapsed after the incidents. He was something else, a person, existing with everything he had been through, without hiding, without embellishing, and most importantly, no longer running away. Time, in a quiet way, had changed how he looked at everything. No longer the question, how to keep it all, but what really remains when everything changes. He looked back at his life, not as a series of successes, not as a story to tell others to admire, but as a journey full of breaks, wrong choices, moments when he had not understood himself enough to do better. And, for the first time, he did not try to justify it. He did not blame circumstances. He did not hide behind roles. He simply looked straight at it. There was an honesty in the way he existed. Now not perfect honesty, but honesty enough that he no longer had to pretend. He admitted something he perhaps had never been able to say clearly before, that he had once lost himself. Not in a single moment. Not because of one specific event, but over many years, little by little. When he chose the image instead of the truth. When he chose acceptance instead of being understood. When he lived in the gaze of others instead of listening to himself. And that could not be fixed just by realizing it. But realizing it changed everything. Because when you know where you got lost, you no longer have to continue on that path. Brad Pitt no longer defined his life by fame. The awards, the movies, the numbers were still there, still part of the story. But they were no longer the center. They were no longer what he used to measure his value. because he had seen what happens when you put your entire self into things that can change. Instead, he began to look at other things that cannot be measured by numbers, cannot be written in headlines, but are the only things left when everything else disappears: presence, honesty, the ability to stay with himself even when it is not easy. His legacy, in a way, no longer lay in what he had achieved, but in what he had learned. Not the image of a perfect man, but the story of a person who had gone through being lost, who had faced himself, and who still continued to move forward even without all the answers. Not an unbreakable symbol, but a man who had broken and learned how to keep living without needing to piece every fragment back together like before. And perhaps that was exactly what made his story real, not because it was beautiful, but because it did not try to be beautiful. Not because it was perfect, but because it accepted imperfection as part of itself. There are mornings when he wakes up without the question of who he has to become. No more pressure to maintain anything, just another day with everything it brings. There are moments he still remembers, still regrets, still wonders what would have happened if he had understood himself earlier. But he no longer stays in those questions for too long, not because they are not important, but because he understands that life is not lived in what-ifs. It is lived in what remains, and what remains, even if not perfect, is still real. And in all of that, there is a truth he no longer runs away from, a simple truth, but one that took an entire lifetime to be able to say, "I didn't lose everything. I lost who I was, and I'm still learning how to live with that." The story of Brad Pitt is not a familiar Hollywood victory journey, but a haunting portrait of the price of losing yourself while the whole world believes you have it all. What makes people ache does not lie in the titles or the divorces exploited by the media, but in the very human chain of details. A boy who grew up in a disciplined family but lacked emotional connection, a man who learned to please others to the point of forgetting who he was. And the climax being that fateful night in 2016, when everything collapsed. He did not just lose his family, but also lost the only place he had ever felt real. The years after that, his turning to Alcoholics Anonymous, sitting in rooms without fame, and quietly facing the truth about himself, showed a silent courage that few saw. His turning to sculpture and painting was not to become greater, but simply to have a place to put the pain that is the detail that makes the story painful, but also very real. And perhaps the final quote, "I lost who I was, and I'm still learning how to live with that," is the most accurate summary of his entire life. For American audiences, a society that often honors success, fame, and perfect images, this story is a powerful reminder. You can achieve everything the world considers success, but if you lose connection with yourself, the price to pay will be an emptiness that nothing can fill. The lesson is not to avoid failure, but to learn to be honest with yourself before it is too late. Because sometimes the hardest thing is not building a life, but keeping your true self throughout that journey. If this story makes you reflect on your own life, please hit subscribe to the channel and share to spread real stories that are not perfect, but full of meaning. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore people who seem strong but carry pains that no one sees.